Hello, BookTube, and welcome to part 2 of my ongoing vlog where we are looking at Keith Thomas's book, Religion and the Decline of Magic, published in 1971. Now, let's talk about, since Keith Thomas himself, if you remember the last vlog, he said one of the advantages of his book was that he didn't expect, nor did it need to be read in chapter order. You could pick out an individual chapter and highlight it. And I'm kind of going to do that. I'm going to zoom in on chapter 6. And why is that? Because that is the chapter that sold this book for me. When I was browsing in a secondhand bookshop and looking at this volume, this immense thing, and I was just paging through the chapter headings to see what was it about and would I like it and would I want to buy it? It was chapter 6 that really stood out. Let's talk too about the person who watches television. He was studying for his history degree at the Open University at the time that I bought this book. And history was a subject that he hated at school because it was a lot of memory work without any real context and no space made for any analysis or debate or discussion. That was not what 1950s history education was about. And our church as well, that we were attending at the time, as you can imagine, they had their own version of history, and we both accepted it because we hadn't done enough reading to know any better. But once we started reading, and this was the book that began, I think, there were a number of books for me, but I think for the person who watches television, it was this book which I bought, which began to sort of crack open that facade that we kind of painted over our minds of this is how history is and this is the way things are. And that began to show cracks and truth began to seep into those cracks. And we began to think, no, this isn't quite the way things are. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's talk about our assumptions at the time we bought the book. We assumed, and I don't think this is an uncommon assumption, that before the 19th century, before the scientific discoveries, including Darwin's formulation of the theory of evolution, we just believed that men were uniformly of the same level of believing. They might have doctrinal differences, sure, absolutely, but that atheism or agnosticism was a very rare thing, if it even existed at all, that most of the accusations of atheism were just, people trying to put false accusations on someone else. And about England, we believed the situation exactly as it was described by Keith Thomas on page 179 of his book, which I'm going to read now. Quote, "The Anglican Church was nothing less than society itself in one of its most important manifestations." Absolutely. This sounded exactly like what we assumed. Everybody believed, everybody went to church unless they were very ill. And so chapter 6 absolutely shocked us because it just blew all those myths out the doors, out the windows. I'm going to read you now from the opening of the chapter. Thomas begins first by stating the assumption that the English church was a commonality. He says, "But religious worship emphasized the unity of society as well as its social divisions. It was a collective act, common prayer, an affirmation of social solidarity. However, a Kentish parson taught in 1543 that there was not one heaven, but three, one for very poor men, the second one for men of mean estate and condition, and the third for great men." In other words, and this makes me laugh because this is so English, there was class division in heaven. And immediately that creates a problem. I don't think for a minute that this was something published, but the fact that this Kentish parson believed this suggested that there may have been a more widespread belief that what salvation was for a poor man was different than what salvation was for a rich man. And this meant that there was room within the English church for class division and therefore ideological division. And it began, strangely, Thomas believes that these cracks began to show more once the Reformation started because the tradition of confession ceased. Obviously, in the Catholic Church, all believers had to come to church to confess their sins reasonably often. Once that was no longer a need and the church no longer was where you came to get advice about how to go along with your life. As Thomas said, in some respects, Orthodox religion did not enjoy a monopoly of popular loyalty, and in several respects it was highly vulnerable to competition from outside. Regarding the confessional, of course, it was also a great source of power. If you were a priest in a small village, by the time you'd heard everyone's confessions, you had a strong idea of what was going on in that whole community. You were very connected to all the people there, and you could therefore attune your advice with the ideas of the other things that you'd heard taken into consideration, even if you didn't tell those things to those who came for confession, because you were keeping their confessions private. So that loss of power meant that you wouldn't always know what the whole community was doing. But what Thomas also goes on to point out is that church attendance during the early Reformation, and even earlier, was not universal. In fact, it was actually rather on the low side, even though it was much better than church attendance today. Failing to attend church, yes, it was a crime in the law books, but very little was done, particularly in the English countryside, to police regular church-going among the lower classes. In other words, the majority of people. Thomas does consider that there were some good reasons for non-attendance. At certain times of the year, the poor had to work, regardless of what day it was. And in times of plague, the upper classes actually preferred it if the poor didn't come to church because they were suspected to be the greatest carriers of the disease. And of course, there were dissenters and small numbers of people who were excommunicated by the church courts for some infraction. So that surprised us, that really there was a large group of people, mainly the poorer people, who didn't attend church regularly. Secondly, and this really shocked us, because Thomas talked about the behavior of those who did attend. And he said, even, this is a direct quote, even when they did put in a reluctant appearance, the conduct of many churchgoers left so much to be desired as to turn the service into a travesty. And I'm going to read now from the second paragraph on page 191, because this shocked me, so I imagine it will shock others. So I'm carrying on with the paragraph that I started quoting from. Presentments made before the ecclesiastical courts show that virtually every kind of irreverent and irrelevant activity took place during divine worship. Members of the congregation jostled for pews, nudged their neighbors, hawked and spat, knitted, made coarse remarks, told jokes, fell asleep, or even let off guns. Yeah, preaching was popular with the educated classes, but aroused the irritation of others. Stephen Gardiner told in 1547 of one parish in Cambridge where, quote, when the vicar goes into the pulpit to read that which he himself hath written, then the multitude of the parish goes straight out of the church, home to drink. And it is clear that the alehouse could compete effectively with a sermon. And once he mounted the pulpit, moreover, the incumbent ran the risk of being humiliated by frivolous or insulting asides from his audience. When Mr. Evans, who was the rector of Holland Magna, Essex, preached in 1630 about Adam and Eve making themselves coats of fig leaves, one loud-mouthed parishioner demanded to know where they got the thread to sew them with. When another contemporary preacher attempted to explain that heaven was so high that a millstone would take hundreds of years to come down from it, one of his hearers asked how long in that case it would take a man to get up there. When the Elizabethan curate of Stogursey, Somerset, went on too long, a member of the congregation bawled out that it was time for him to come down so the maids might go a-milking. And I'll keep reading because this just gets better. Such disrespect was frequently punished in the church courts, but it could arouse sympathy among the congregation. A Cambridgeshire man was charged with indecent behaviour in church in 1598 after his most loathsome farting, striking, and scoffing speeches had occasioned the great offence of the good and the great rejoicing of the bad. The tone of many Elizabethan congregations seems to have been that of a tiresome class of schoolboys. When they poured out of church into the tavern, a stream of blasphemous jokes signified their release from unwelcome restraint. At Westbury, Gloucestershire, in 1610, a gang of youths, after being catechized by the minister, fell to dancing, quaffing, and rioting, and composed a blasphemous and irreverent catechism of their own. So what he seems to be saying is bad behavior in church from the lower orders was not at all uncommon. And it was partly boredom. The third reason that Thomas gives for, why the lower classes weren't particularly religious was that they really couldn't understand what was being preached. The clergy, when they did finally speak in English, they pitched their discourse far above the capacity of most of their listeners. And the lack of education meant that even the simplest sermon might not make any sense to the poor, who could not own or read an English Bible for the most part, and they were never taught parts of it by rote. And it's that astounding ignorance of even the rudiments of Christian theology that also stunned us. Listen to this. When, in 1551, the new Protestant Bishop of Gloucester carried out a survey of the clergy, he found that of 311, there were 171 who could not repeat the 10 Commandments, 27 who did not know the author of the Lord's Prayer, and 10 who could not repeat it. A few years later, a petition for services in English complained that before the Reformation, none of the laity who knew no Latin could say the Lord's Prayer in English, or knew any article of the Creed, or could recite the 10 Commandments. An Essex minister reported in 1598 that the religious knowledge of half the population would disgrace a 10-year-old child. 3 years later, another minister observed that in places where there was no preaching, the people were ignorant of God as Turks or pagans. In one parish of 400, he had found only 10% who had any knowledge of the basic Christian dogmas. That being the case, how much could these people be influenced, those who didn't know, those who simply had no knowledge of the Bible or of the basic principles of their religion? What could they even do with Christianity? What could it even mean to them? How could it be used to guide their lives? Whereas with magic, astrology, all the charms and the works of wise women and cunning men, those they knew quite intimately, because those would be very close at hand and dealt with common things that they understood. And Keith Thomas also talks about the rites of Christianity, confirmation, baptism. These things lapsed a little bit in rural England, precisely because you needed to do some educating of the people who were about to receive confirmation or have their child baptized, so that they knew what it was they were agreeing to do. And now I'm going to read again from page 197, a report from the Bishop of Peterborough. When White Kennet visited Rutland as Bishop of Peterborough in 1722, he found there had been no confirmation there for 40 years. Some even escaped being christened. In the mid-18th century, a writer commented on, quote, perhaps no inconsiderable number among the lowest classes of the people who are never brought to be baptized at all. Now, that's partly because baptism costs money, and sometimes too much money. But it's interesting, therefore, that what we see is the majority of the population, the poorest part of the population, really not participating knowledgeably in Christianity at all. And that's astounding. But what it does suggest then is a cultural difference. And I'm going to try to explain, because this is why the book fascinated myself and the person who watches television, because we noticed, having spent time in the United States, and obviously now we're living in the UK, there's a big difference. And anyone who's from America, who's moved to the UK, you notice a big difference in the way the United Kingdom regards religion. You could even call the English irreligious, non-religious, not really interested in religion, certainly in comparison to the bulk of Northern European descended white Americans, where there's a much stronger interest in religion. People want to know what church you attend. It's something that you would never ask anyone in this country unless you wanted to greatly embarrass yourself, because it would be a highly personal question to ask. And we wondered if this division, where it was those who were slightly better off that were more actively involved in religion, and the bulk of the population who were very poor, really completely disengaged from the church and not seeing it as their main source of guidance in their lives, is that why, when the groups that did go over to the Americas to settle, which were mainly Puritans, mainly nonconformists who were fleeing after the restoration of the monarchy of Charles II, because he was not happy when he came back. He may be considered a jovial king in his social life, but my goodness, the revenge that he took on those who had killed his father or participated in any way in the government afterwards, or had any opinion that contradicted his religiously. There was a reason why people left for America. They needed to. They were in proper danger. But those people who left were mainly of the middle mercantile classes, those who were up and coming and who had their own religious interests that involved preaching in English, preaching more plainly, therefore having a more personal engagement with both the church service itself, but also were more likely to own and be literate enough to read an English Bible. So you had a whole different group of people going over to what is now the United States of America. You had a much more engaged group that felt they had, I hesitate to use the word ownership, but I think that's probably the best word. They felt connected to, they felt religion mattered to them and meant something to them. The bulk of the people that were left behind in England, as you can now see, were completely disengaged from the Christian church altogether. It didn't do anything for them. And that didn't improve in the 19th century, when many of those very poor people were transferred from work agriculturally on the land into huge industrial cities, where there wasn't the provision made for them always to attend a church, and they often were just too exhausted to want to attend, and still didn't feel the church had anything that it could offer them realistically. But Thomas goes on to say in chapter 6 that skepticism wasn't confined to just the lower classes who really didn't even know what it was they weren't meant to be believing in, if that makes any sense. In the very upper classes, and again, this would be the group that stayed put as well, there was room for skepticism. Thomas devotes a whole section of chapter 6 to collecting as many expressions of religious skepticism as he can that were written down by the aristocracy, doubting the existence of the Trinity, of heaven, hell, the devil, or God. All of this, and most of this was the writing of very wealthy men, because they were the ones educated enough not only to do the writing, but to have the materials, which also cost money. Expressions of skepticism from the lower classes probably existed, but they didn't get as much opportunity. Although what you might want to check out, my very first nonfiction review was Christopher Hill's The World Turned Upside Down, which examines more closely that brief window of 10 years when the lower classes had their opportunity to start expressing their own religious ideas. Those who hadn't formerly had a voice suddenly had one, and they had some interesting ideas, but they did completely overthrow the existing Christian order in most cases. But Thomas deals with that irreverence as well. He says the relative freedom of the interregnum brought much of this endemic skepticism into the open. In 1648, the authors of the blasphemy ordinance of that year found it necessary to prescribe punishments for those who denied immortality, cast doubt on the scriptures, rejected Christ and the Holy Ghost, and even denied that there was a God or that he was almighty. Some of these heresies found a refuge among the sects. And so he goes on to describe how these small dissenting groups rejected very fundamental beliefs of Christianity. And some of them were the bedrock of secularism, really, because many of these groups were more political than when they were religious. When they were rejecting all these doctrines, what they were really saying was, do we need this thing called religion? Is it really needed to hold society together? And that's a strong indicator that a group of people had already been virtually without religion as a social coherent, and they were doing just fine, and they wanted to voice that opinion. And Thomas ends chapter 6 by saying, "Not enough justice has been done to the volume of apathy, heterodoxy, and agnosticism which existed long before the onset of industrialization. Even the most primitive societies have their religious skeptics. It may be that social changes increased the volume of skepticism in the 16th and 17th century England. What is clear is that the hold of organized religion upon the people was never so complete as to leave no room for rival systems of belief." And that's really the bedrock. I think chapter 6, myself, ought to have been chapter 1 or the introduction to this book, to sort of say there was room in England for other systems of belief, and here's why. And so I found that a really powerful chapter. And I know I've gone on about it a bit and haven't really covered some of the other chapters in the book, which are really dealing with these different aspects of magical practice. But I think it's chapter 6 that's pivotal. It's chapter 6 which said this is why England is the way it is. This is why England had its peculiar form of Reformation, which in some ways came very close, particularly in that interregnum period, from saying, I think we could throw out baby and bathwater here. Maybe we don't even need religion as a framework. Of course, that was very quickly put back into place and enforced when Charles II returned. But there are things that you can and can't enforce. You can't change people's minds. You can change their behavior outwardly, but you cannot change an inward skepticism that has grown as the result of experience. And I think that is what this chapter really did for myself and the person who watches television. We thought, wait a second, something broke open there, and it never really went back to the way it had been, although it's questionable whether the way it had been was as good as we had thought it was. So it opened up all kinds of questions about Christian belief and behavior in English life. And I wish that Thomas had the time and the capacity to go on to continental Europe, because I don't know to what degree the English experience is mirrored in other countries, particularly in Central Europe, Germany in particular. What was the Protestant Reformation? What did it give to the people there socially and politically? Perhaps for the English, because they were already a politically coherent unit, it gave them a different way of seeing themselves as a group. And yeah, I found it fascinating. And I can't really talk about that chapter too much. I almost think that chapter alone was what sold the book for me. That was the reason I spent money on it. But that doesn't mean the other chapters aren't worth going into. And I will do, but I will leave that now for another vlog. So look out for that, because I think I've spoken long enough. Thanks everybody for tuning in. If you did, I hope that was informative, a bit eye-opening perhaps, and I'll see you again in a few days' time with some new content. Take care in the meantime. Bye-bye.